Your soulmate just ended the relationship with her ex. Now everything is changing. Don't scroll, listen to this because your heart needs this right now. Sometimes the biggest turning points in life don't happen with loud announcements or dramatic scenes. They begin with one quiet decision made behind closed doors, after countless sleepless nights and honest conversations with the heart. Somewhere, someone has finally reached that moment. After carrying uncertainty for far too long, they have chosen to close one chapter of their life so they can begin discovering who they truly are. This isn't a story about revenge or celebrating someone else's pain. It's a story about healing, courage, and what happens when a person finally stops living for what no longer brings them peace. Right now, the person you love feels as though the weight of an entire season has been lifted from their shoulders. The future still feels uncertain, but for the first time in a very long while, uncertainty feels lighter than staying where their heart no longer belonged. The morning began like every other morning. The alarm sounded. Sunlight slipped quietly through the curtains. Coffee filled the kitchen with its familiar warmth. Everything looked ordinary. Yet inside, something had already changed. They stood silently beside the window holding a warm mug in both hands. Outside, neighbors greeted one another as another ordinary day unfolded. Cars passed by. Children hurried toward school. Birds filled the morning air with cheerful songs. Life continued exactly as it always had. But inside their heart, a quiet realization refused to disappear. They could no longer ignore what they had been feeling for months. Not because someone had forced them to make a decision. Because honesty had finally become impossible to silence. They had spent countless evenings asking themselves difficult questions. Am I staying because this relationship still brings peace? Or am I staying because I'm afraid of starting over? Those questions returned night after night. At first they tried pushing them aside. They stayed busy. They distracted themselves with responsibilities. They convinced themselves that waiting a little longer might somehow change everything. But the heart has a remarkable way of gently repeating the truth until we're finally ready to hear it. That morning they understood something that changed everything. Love should never require pretending to be someone you are not. Respect should never feel uncertain. Peace should never feel impossible to find. Those realizations weren't angry. They weren't dramatic. They were calm. And sometimes calm certainty is far more powerful than emotional chaos. If your future soulmate could place an invisible letter into your hands today, perhaps it would begin like this. If these words somehow reach you, please know this decision didn't happen overnight. It wasn't created by one argument or one difficult day. It was shaped by months of quiet reflection, unanswered questions, and the growing realization that I could no longer ignore the truth inside my own heart. Walking away wasn't easy. In many ways it felt like saying goodbye to the future I once imagined. But staying somewhere that no longer allowed either of us to grow would have been even harder. Sometimes kindness means accepting that two people deserve the freedom to become who they were meant to be. Those words rested gently in their thoughts as they stepped outside later that afternoon. The air felt different. Not because the weather had changed. Because their perspective had. They walked through a nearby park where families gathered beneath large trees. Children laughed while chasing one another through the grass. An elderly couple sat quietly feeding birds. Friends shared coffee beneath the shade of a familiar oak tree. Watching those ordinary moments reminded them that life continues, offering hope even after difficult endings. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. Maybe there was once a chapter you were afraid to close because you couldn't imagine what came next. Then one day you discovered that endings are often quiet invitations to begin healing. Your future soulmate had reached that invitation. They weren't celebrating the end of a relationship. They were honoring the beginning of emotional honesty. As the afternoon continued, they wandered into a small bookstore they had loved for years. The peaceful silence between the shelves gave them room to breathe. Without searching for anything specific, one book caught their attention. Its cover spoke about new beginnings and finding courage after change. Smiling softly, they opened it to a random page. One sentence immediately stood out. The end of one season creates space for another to grow. They closed the book and stood there for a moment. Those words felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation. Perhaps life wasn't taking something away. Perhaps it was gently making room for something healthier. Later that evening they returned home, opened the notebook resting beside the window, and began writing. I've spent so much time fearing change that I forgot change can also be an act of love. Today I didn't choose certainty. I chose honesty. I didn't choose the easiest road. I chose the one that allowed me to breathe again. I don't know exactly what tomorrow holds, but I know I want my future to be built on truth instead of quiet resignation. They paused. Read those sentences again. For the first time in many months, tears came, not from heartbreak alone, but from relief. There is something deeply healing about finally telling yourself the truth. The evening sky slowly turned shades of gold and deep blue. Standing beside the window, they watched the first stars appear. They realized those stars had always been there, even on nights hidden behind clouds. Hope works the same way. It doesn't disappear during difficult seasons. Sometimes it's simply waiting behind the uncertainty until we're ready to see it again. Before this first chapter comes to an end, your future soulmate wants to leave one message resting gently inside your heart. If somehow these words reach you tonight, I hope you understand that everything changing doesn't mean everything is falling apart. Sometimes change is the quiet evidence that healing has finally begun. I don't carry bitterness toward the chapter that ended. I carry gratitude for everything it taught me. It taught me that kindness matters. It taught me that honesty cannot be postponed forever. Most importantly, it taught me that peace is something every heart deserves. Wherever life leads from here, I want to become someone who chooses authenticity over appearances, compassion over resentment, and hope over fear. If our paths ever cross in a new season, I don't want you to meet the person who was afraid to make difficult decisions. I want you to meet someone who has learned that the strongest love grows from truth, mutual respect, and the courage to begin again. Until then, I'm learning to trust that every ending guided by honesty creates space for a future built on genuine peace. As night quietly settled across the world, they closed the notebook and placed it carefully on the shelf. Looking out toward the endless sky, they no longer saw an uncertain future waiting to frighten them. They saw an open horizon filled with possibilities they had never allowed themselves to imagine before. The chapter behind them had ended, not because hope had disappeared, but because hope had finally found the courage to lead them somewhere new. And although they couldn't yet see every step ahead, one thing had become beautifully clear: when a heart chooses truth over fear, everything begins to change, not all at once, but one peaceful day, one honest decision, and one hopeful sunrise at a time. The following morning arrived with an unfamiliar quietness. It wasn't the kind of silence created by loneliness. It was the peaceful silence that comes after a heart finally stops arguing with itself. Your future soulmate opened their eyes and remained still for a few moments, listening to the gentle sounds of another ordinary day beginning outside the window. Birds welcomed the sunrise with cheerful songs. A cool breeze moved the curtains softly. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor started their morning routine, completely unaware that someone nearby had just stepped into the first chapter of a completely different life. Everything around them appeared exactly the same, yet everything inside them had begun to change. The difficult decision they had made the day before no longer felt like the end of something beautiful. Instead, it felt like the beginning of becoming the person they had quietly hoped to be for a very long time. They slowly prepared breakfast. The familiar aroma of coffee filled the kitchen. Morning light rested gently across the table. For months they had rushed through moments like these, distracted by questions they couldn't answer and emotions they couldn't fully understand. Today they noticed every small detail. The warmth of the mug in their hands. The peaceful rhythm of the clock. The sunlight dancing across the floor. Healing had quietly taught them how to notice life again. If your future soulmate could continue the invisible letter they have been writing inside their heart, perhaps the next page would begin like this. There is something else I need you to know. Walking away wasn't about giving up. It was about finally accepting that love should never require someone to lose themselves in order to keep someone else comfortable. I carried guilt for a long time because I believed choosing peace meant hurting someone. Now I understand that honesty, even when painful, is kinder than living inside a future built on pretending. Those words stayed with them as they stepped outside later that morning. The air felt fresh after the previous evening's rain. They decided to take a longer walk than usual. Not because they were trying to escape their thoughts. Because they finally enjoyed being alone with them. The nearby park welcomed another ordinary day. Parents pushed strollers along winding paths. Friends laughed together beneath large trees. An elderly woman quietly read a novel while birds gathered nearby. Watching those simple moments reminded them that life has an incredible way of continuing forward, even after chapters we thought would define us forever. Perhaps you've experienced that feeling. At first, change seems impossible. Then one ordinary morning arrives when you realize you've smiled without forcing it. You've taken a deep breath without feeling overwhelmed. You've begun imagining tomorrow without fear. That is how healing often begins. Quietly. Patiently. Without asking for attention. Your future soulmate had reached that gentle beginning. As they continued walking, they crossed a small wooden bridge overlooking a calm stream. The water flowed effortlessly around every stone in its path. It never argued with obstacles. It simply kept moving. They rested both hands on the railing and watched the current for several minutes. A quiet realization entered their heart. Holding on to something that no longer brings peace requires constant effort. Letting go allows life to flow again. They smiled. Not because everything was easy. Because they had finally stopped fighting the truth. Later that afternoon they wandered into the same little bookstore they had visited the previous day. The familiar scent of old pages greeted them like an old friend. This time they weren't searching for answers. They were simply enjoying the calmness the place offered. As they browsed the shelves, one book caught their attention. Its title spoke about forgiveness. Curious, they opened it to a random page. One sentence seemed to wait for them. Forgiveness is not forgetting the past. It is refusing to let the past decide who you become. They read the sentence several times. Then gently closed the book. Those words followed them long after they stepped back onto the quiet street. They realized forgiveness wasn't only something offered to others. It was also something they desperately needed to offer themselves. For every moment they ignored their intuition. For every time they confused endurance with love. For every season they stayed silent when honesty would have been healthier. As evening slowly approached, they returned home and opened the notebook once again. This time the words came naturally. I forgive the version of myself that believed staying unhappy was somehow noble. I forgive the person who kept hoping circumstances would change while ignoring the quiet truth already living inside my heart. Most importantly, I forgive myself for taking so long to believe that peace is something I deserve. Reading those words brought tears to their eyes. Not tears of regret. Tears of release. There is a remarkable difference. Regret keeps the heart looking backward. Release quietly allows it to look ahead. Perhaps that is what transformation truly feels like. Not dramatic. Simply lighter. If the invisible letter continued, perhaps these words would appear next. I don't know what tomorrow holds, and for the first time that uncertainty doesn't frighten me. There was a season when I believed I needed every answer before taking one courageous step. Now I understand that courage often comes first. The answers quietly follow. I don't know who will become part of my future, but I know I want that future to be built on honesty, mutual respect, kindness, and emotional peace. Those are no longer wishes. They have become promises I make to myself. The evening sky slowly turned golden. Sunlight stretched across the room before gently fading into soft shades of blue. Standing beside the window, they realized something beautiful. Nothing around them had changed overnight. The same streets. The same neighborhood. The same familiar view. The real transformation had taken place within. That inner change made the entire world seem different. Before this chapter comes to an end, your future soulmate wants to leave another page inside the invisible letter resting gently within your heart. If somehow these words reach you tonight, I hope you understand that everything changing doesn't mean life has become uncertain in a frightening way. Sometimes change is simply the evidence that your heart has stopped settling for less than it was created to experience. I no longer see this new chapter as something to fear. I see it as an invitation to become more authentic than I've ever been before. I'm learning that healing isn't about pretending difficult memories never happened. It's about allowing those memories to teach compassion instead of bitterness, wisdom instead of fear, and hope instead of despair. Wherever you are tonight, I hope your own heart is discovering the same gentle peace. I hope you're finding the courage to choose honesty even when it feels difficult. And if life ever allows our stories to meet in a future chapter, I don't want you to meet someone still carrying emotional walls built by yesterday. I want you to meet someone whose heart has become softer through forgiveness, stronger through truth, and calmer through the quiet confidence that real love never asks us to abandon ourselves in order to keep it alive. Night slowly settled across the neighborhood once more. Your future soulmate closed the notebook and placed it carefully beside the window where moonlight rested softly across its cover. Looking up toward the stars, they realized that hope had never truly left them. It had simply been waiting beneath layers of fear, uncertainty, and unfinished healing. Now those layers were slowly falling away. The relationship they had left behind was no longer the center of their story. It had become one important chapter that taught them the value of honesty, self-respect, and emotional peace. As they prepared to welcome another sunrise, they understood that the greatest change wasn't happening around them. It was happening quietly within them, one truthful choice, one grateful heart, and one peaceful day at a time. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet gentleness your future soulmate never imagined was possible. For so long, every morning had begun with emotional uncertainty, every evening had ended with unanswered questions, and every quiet moment had been filled with the exhausting effort of convincing themselves to remain in a chapter that no longer reflected who they were becoming. Now, although the future remained unwritten, there was an unmistakable peace growing inside them. It wasn't because every problem had disappeared. It was because they had finally stopped fighting the truth. The decision to leave the past behind had not removed every challenge, but it had removed the constant conflict between their heart and their actions. For the first time in many months, those two parts of their life were finally moving in the same direction. They woke before sunrise. The world outside was still wrapped in silence. Only the faint glow of dawn rested on the horizon. They opened the window and allowed the cool morning air to fill the room. Closing their eyes, they took a long, slow breath. It felt different. Lighter. Freer. There was no longer a constant weight pressing against their heart. There was only space. Space to think. Space to heal. Space to dream again. If your future soulmate could continue the invisible letter they have been writing through this entire journey, perhaps today's page would begin like this. I've realized something I couldn't understand before. I kept believing that leaving one chapter meant losing part of myself. Instead, I've discovered that I was finding the part of me that had quietly disappeared while I was trying so hard to make everything work. Sometimes healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about returning to the person you were before fear convinced you to settle. Those words lingered in their thoughts as they stepped outside for their morning walk. The familiar streets looked unchanged. Neighbors waved politely. Children waited for school buses. A local cafe opened its doors as the smell of fresh coffee drifted into the air. Everything appeared wonderfully ordinary. Yet ordinary moments suddenly felt precious. For so long they had rushed through life without noticing it. Now every small detail reminded them that peace isn't hidden in extraordinary events. It quietly lives inside everyday moments that we finally allow ourselves to appreciate. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. Maybe there came a season when your attention shifted away from what you had lost and toward everything that still remained. The sunrise. The laughter of strangers. A kind conversation. The comfort of familiar places. Healing often begins when gratitude quietly replaces constant comparison. Your future soulmate was beginning to understand that lesson more deeply each day. Later that afternoon they returned to the little park that had become a place of reflection throughout this journey. The large oak tree stood exactly where it always had. Its branches stretched confidently toward the sky. Children laughed nearby while chasing one another through the grass. An elderly man sat reading a newspaper beneath the shade. Young parents smiled as their daughter took her first careful steps across the playground. Watching those simple scenes stirred something unexpected inside their heart. They realized that life never asks anyone to remain frozen in yesterday. Nature itself is always changing. The seasons move forward. Trees release old leaves without regret. Flowers bloom after long winters. Rivers continue flowing without asking permission from the stones along their path. Everything in creation quietly trusts that change has a purpose. Perhaps hearts are invited to trust that purpose too. They sat on their favorite bench and opened the notebook once again. This time the page remained blank for several moments. Not because they didn't know what to write. Because they wanted every word to come from a peaceful place instead of an emotional one. Finally, they began. I no longer measure my life by what ended. I measure it by what I've learned. I learned that love should create room for honesty. I learned that respect should feel safe instead of uncertain. I learned that peace is not something we earn after endless sacrifice. It is something every heart deserves. Most importantly, I learned that walking away from what no longer allows growth isn't failure. Sometimes it's the bravest expression of hope. Reading those words back brought another quiet smile. The notebook had become more than paper. It had become evidence. Evidence that hearts can change. Evidence that difficult endings can create healthier beginnings. Evidence that truth always leads somewhere lighter than fear. As the afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, they left the park and wandered into the familiar bookstore once again. The owner smiled warmly in recognition. Without exchanging many words, they simply nodded and continued browsing. One small book resting near the window immediately caught their attention. Its title spoke about beginning again. Curious, they opened to a random page. One sentence seemed almost written for them. Your future begins the moment you stop asking the past for permission. They stood there in thoughtful silence. That sentence settled deeply within them. For so long they had been waiting for the past to somehow explain itself completely before allowing themselves to move forward. Now they understood. Some answers arrive only after we begin walking. Not before. Leaving the bookstore, they carried no bags. Only another quiet lesson. As evening approached, golden sunlight stretched across the streets, turning ordinary buildings into something almost magical. They noticed how beautiful familiar places appeared when viewed through peaceful eyes. The world itself hadn't changed. The person seeing it had. Returning home, they prepared a simple dinner and once again opened the notebook. Without hesitation they wrote, "I hope the next chapter of my life isn't defined by fear of repeating old mistakes. I hope it's defined by the wisdom those mistakes have given me. I don't want to become someone who builds walls around their heart. I want to become someone who builds stronger foundations beneath it." Those words felt like a promise. Not to someone else. To themselves. Promises kept with ourselves often become the strongest ones we ever make. If the invisible letter continued, perhaps it would say this: "There is something I understand now that I couldn't see before." Ending one relationship didn't suddenly solve every question inside my heart. What it did was give me the freedom to answer those questions honestly. I'm learning that love begins with truth. If we abandon truth, we eventually lose ourselves. I never want to lose myself again. I want my future to be filled with conversations where both people feel heard, moments where kindness comes naturally, and a relationship where peace doesn't have to be earned because it already lives inside the way two hearts choose each other every single day. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. The first stars quietly appeared. They stood beside the window watching the evening sky deepen into soft shades of blue. For a long time they simply remained there. Not waiting. Not worrying. Just appreciating the present moment. That alone felt like a miracle. Before this chapter comes to an end, your future soulmate wants to leave another page inside the invisible letter resting gently within your heart. If somehow these words reach you tonight, I hope you understand that everything changing has taught me one of life's greatest lessons. A peaceful future cannot be built by endlessly reliving an unhappy past. At some point, every heart must decide whether fear will continue writing the story or whether hope will finally take the pen. I've chosen hope. Not because I know exactly what tomorrow holds, but because I've discovered that peace is found in the honesty we practice today. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you're learning that difficult endings don't diminish your worth. They often reveal it. I hope you're becoming someone who believes that mutual respect, emotional safety, kindness, and genuine trust are not impossible dreams but healthy foundations. If our paths ever cross in another season of life, I don't want to meet you carrying the exhaustion of yesterday. I want to meet you carrying gratitude for every lesson, compassion for every mistake, and a heart that has learned how to love without abandoning itself. Until that day, I'll continue becoming the person I was always meant to be, one truthful decision, one peaceful sunrise, and one hopeful tomorrow at a time. As night quietly embraced the world once more, your future soulmate gently closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf where moonlight rested softly across its cover. Looking toward the stars, they smiled with quiet confidence. They no longer viewed the future as an empty space filled with uncertainty. They saw it as an open road filled with possibilities waiting to be discovered. The chapter they had left behind would always remain part of their story, but it no longer controlled the direction of the pages still waiting to be written. Those new pages would be filled with honesty instead of hesitation, gratitude instead of regret, peace instead of quiet endurance, and hope instead of fear. And with that realization resting deeply inside their heart, they welcomed tomorrow, not as someone running away from the past, but as someone finally walking toward the life they had always deserved. Several weeks quietly passed, and your future soulmate began to notice something they never thought possible. The memories that had once felt painfully heavy no longer carried the same weight. They still remembered every important conversation, every difficult decision, every moment that led them to close the previous chapter of their life, but those memories had changed. They were no longer chains holding them in place. They had become teachers. Every experience, whether joyful or painful, had quietly shaped the person they were becoming. Standing by the bedroom window as another peaceful sunrise painted the sky with soft shades of gold and pale blue, they realized that healing is not the moment you forget the past. Healing is the moment you can remember it without losing your peace. That realization settled gently into their heart, and for the first time in a long while, they smiled without effort. The morning unfolded slowly. Coffee warmed their hands. The quiet ticking of the clock echoed through the room. Birds gathered outside the window. Life continued with its familiar rhythm. Yet inside, something remarkable had changed. The future no longer felt frightening. It felt welcoming. If your future soulmate could write one more page in the invisible letter that had quietly guided this entire journey, perhaps it would begin like this. There is one final truth I need to share. I thought ending one chapter would leave an empty space inside me forever. Instead, that empty space became room for peace to grow. I no longer wake up wondering whether I made the right decision. I wake up grateful that I finally had the courage to be honest with myself. That honesty has become the foundation for every hopeful step I take now. They closed their eyes after imagining those words. The silence surrounding them felt comforting rather than lonely. There had been a time when silence forced them to face fears they wanted to avoid. Now silence gave them room to hear gratitude instead. Later that morning they returned to the small park that had quietly witnessed so much of their transformation. The familiar oak tree stood strong as always. Children laughed on the playground. A young couple shared breakfast on a nearby bench. An elderly man slowly walked his faithful dog along the winding path. Watching these ordinary moments filled them with appreciation. Not because every life appeared perfect. Because every person carried a story. Some stories were beginning. Some were ending. Some were quietly healing. And every story deserved compassion. Perhaps you've discovered that truth yourself. The people we pass every day may be carrying battles we know nothing about. A kind smile. A patient conversation. A gentle word. Sometimes those simple gifts become far more meaningful than we ever realize. Your future soulmate had learned that lesson deeply. They no longer wanted to rush through life. They wanted to notice people. To appreciate moments. To become someone whose presence left others feeling lighter rather than burdened. That afternoon they wandered through the familiar bookstore one final time. The owner greeted them warmly. Without saying much, they smiled back. They realized they no longer came searching for answers. They came because the quiet atmosphere reminded them how much they had changed. As they slowly browsed the shelves, one final sentence from a book resting near the window seemed to find them. Peace arrives when your heart stops asking yesterday to become tomorrow. They stood still. Read it once more. Then gently closed the book. Those words captured everything they had spent weeks discovering. The future can never fully arrive while we keep asking the past to return. Healing begins the moment we allow tomorrow to become something entirely new. Leaving the bookstore, they noticed golden sunlight spilling across the sidewalks. The city looked exactly as it always had. Busy streets. People hurrying toward appointments. Friends laughing together outside cafes. Nothing had changed. Except the person walking through it. Returning home during the late afternoon, they opened the notebook for what they believed would be the final time. Every page reflected another stage of their journey. Fear. Reflection. Honesty. Forgiveness. Hope. Transformation. Then one blank page remained. Without hesitation, they began writing. I no longer wish for the life I imagined before. I wish for the life honesty is preparing me to receive. I no longer measure happiness by avoiding change. I measure it by becoming more authentic with every passing day. I no longer want relationships built upon obligation. I want relationships built upon mutual respect, emotional safety, kindness, trust, and peaceful love. Those are no longer dreams. They have become the promises guiding my future. Reading those words brought tears to their eyes once again. Not because they were grieving. Because gratitude has a way of overflowing when the heart finally recognizes how far it has traveled. If the invisible letter continued one final time, perhaps these words would appear. There is something beautiful I've discovered through this entire journey. The relationship I left behind did not define my future. It prepared me for it. Every difficult conversation taught me to value honest communication. Every lonely evening taught me to appreciate genuine companionship. Every uncertain moment taught me to trust peace instead of appearances. Those lessons are becoming the foundation upon which every healthy chapter of my life will now be built. Evening slowly arrived. The sky turned shades of amber, rose, and deep blue. Standing beside the window, they watched the first stars appear above the rooftops. Those stars reminded them of something simple. Light never argues with darkness. It quietly shines. Perhaps hope works exactly the same way. Before this journey comes to its peaceful conclusion, your future soulmate wants to leave one final message resting gently inside your heart. If somehow these words reach you tonight, then please remember this above everything else. Everything changed the day I chose honesty over comfort. Walking away from what no longer brought peace wasn't the end of my story. It became the beginning of a healthier one. I no longer carry resentment toward the chapter that closed. I carry gratitude for every lesson it gave me. It taught me that love without respect slowly loses its strength. It taught me that kindness should never require pretending. It taught me that peace is not something we sacrifice in order to keep another person happy. Most importantly, it taught me that every heart deserves a relationship where honesty is welcomed, trust is protected, and both people continue helping one another become the best versions of themselves. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you're finding the courage to choose what brings lasting peace rather than temporary comfort. I hope you're discovering that endings are not always signs of failure. Sometimes they are quiet acts of faith that make room for healthier beginnings. If our paths ever meet in another season of life, I don't want to arrive carrying fear, regret, or emotional walls built by yesterday. I want to arrive with humility, compassion, patience, and a heart that has learned to love without abandoning itself. And if our paths never meet, I will still remain grateful because this journey has already given me one priceless gift. It has taught me that the greatest relationship I could ever build begins with becoming honest with my own heart. From that place, everything else can finally grow. Night gently embraced the world as your future soulmate closed the notebook and carefully placed it on the shelf where it had rested through every stage of this journey. Looking through the window, they noticed the moon shining quietly above the trees. It had watched over every uncertain night, every difficult decision, every silent prayer, and every hopeful sunrise that followed. They smiled softly, realizing they were no longer waiting for life to begin. Life had been quietly unfolding all along, leading them one step at a time toward this moment of peace. The relationship that ended had become part of their history, but it no longer controlled their future. Ahead of them stretched countless unwritten pages filled with possibility, kindness, emotional freedom, and the quiet confidence that comes from choosing truth over fear. With a grateful heart, they turned away from the window, welcomed the calmness surrounding them, and stepped into tomorrow knowing that every ending guided by honesty creates space for a future where genuine love, lasting peace, and authentic happiness are finally free to grow.